Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome once again to NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning, being brought to you by the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science. Today, the topic of discussion is development in relation to culture, development as seen in cultural studies. So, let's do a recap of what we had discussed in the last lecture. And you will recall that the last lecture was devoted to time as seen in cultural studies, time as theorized by cultural studies. So, we began with the traditional concepts of time, and we saw that time in the traditionalist framework is seen as teleological, that is, time as having an end, a purpose, and things unfold, where things unfold, events unfold towards a preordained aim or a preordained purpose. Evolutionary framework, the evolutionary framework is also included under the traditionalist concept. At least those aspects of evolutionary theory that see the progress of the species of Homo sapiens, okay, as progressing in a linear sort of way, and hence linearity is also among the terms that are used within a traditionalist framework. Therefore, in the traditionalist framework, there seems to be a purpose as to why time unfolds at all. Then we saw that Michel Foucault gives us the opposite framework, opposite in the sense that there is no teleology here, it is non-teleological. The genealogical method sees time as non-teleological, history as seen as haphazard, a haphazard collection, so to speak, of entangled events where there are deviations, reversals, errors, and reappraisals, where it is not a neat narrative, so to speak, of time unfolding. Further, we saw quite in the beginning really, where Danny Cavallaro says that there may be three central issues, okay, to discussing time within the cultural studies framework, and among the most important are these three. Our grasp of time influences our perception of the world. The way you look at time, the way we experience time, it is apparently related, or it determines our perception of the world. The relationship between time and space is also another area for exploration within cultural studies, and definitely the relationship between time and history. So, these are some of the if not the most important areas under which time is considered in cultural studies. Then we also saw Zeman and Capozzi. Zeman and Capozzi say very importantly that cultural studies of temporality or the study of time is not concerned with the fundamental characteristics of time. Okay, remember we had said that cultural studies, or scientific studies of time may be interested in what the characteristics of time are, but in cultural studies we understand, or we wish to understand time in relation to human life activities, that is to culture, which we saw may be defined as a way of life. Other questions are, for instance, how do the past and future affect the present, and how is history related to culture? We also saw that time may even be textual. Okay? however difficult it is to understand it in those terms, nevertheless, time is textual, time is a matter of linguistic discourse, the description of time, the understanding of time ultimately is a linguistic activity. This is the theory propounded by the post-structuralists. We also found that postmodernism as a framework or a movement or a school of thought also looks or problematizes time, and through Lindia Hutchin we found, I am quoting her here, we constantly narrate the past, but what are the conditions of the knowledge implied by what she calls the totalizing act of narration. Okay? So, there is also an element of power, of tyranny, if you will, if you want to stretch it, of how we constantly narrate the past, but the question is how can the past or how can the present at all know the past that it narrates. So, you see time within cultural studies is highly problematized, right, by cultural theory, by so many of the practitioners. Okay? So, well, today the topic of discussion is development. As you know, development is a topic which lends itself to so many interdisciplinary areas. It itself is an interdisciplinary topic. Okay? You can study development from the point of view of sociology, from the point of view of economics, okay, from the point of view even of literature, right. So, we in this lesson today, we are going to look at development from a cultural studies perspective. Now, as always, let me declare the key sources in this lecture from which I will be gleaning the points and from which I shall be also quoting from time to time. So, these texts are Vincent Tucker, who is an important name in critical development theory. Vincent Tucker's The Myth of Development, a critique of a Eurocentric discourse. The title itself speaks so much, and you will already by now I am sure you have an idea of how the discussion today is going to go. We also look at some of the features of the World Commission on Culture and Development, and then we look at the critic Bhikkhu Parekh's a commitment to cultural pluralism. Development, and I am bringing in time here, in a bid to relate the previous lecture to development, and then I shall be going on to other aspects of development. Okay. Critics say that there is a powerful temporal motive, right, in the discourse of development, right. So, let us look at this slide. The idea of social time as or in terms of progress. Right. So, again you will find that in the discourse of development, in trying to frame policies on development, in trying to understand or even categorize some nations as developed, some nations as underdeveloped and others as developing, right. Time is an important, the temporal motive as it is mentioned here is a very important you could say determinant, right. For instance, social time is understood in terms of progress. So that those nations that are not sort of progressing, quote unquote progressing, okay, in the terms of the mainstream discourse of development as we understand it today, as the mainstream discourse understands it today as economic well-being, okay, infrastructural development, right. Some nations are seen as lagging behind in time. So, that the idea of social time is understood in terms of progress. Okay. Then the second point in this slide, development is seen again from a development from times of barbarism to civilization. You will again see the trope of linearity here, okay, the trope of progress here. And the understanding of development, okay, is understood in terms of the Enlightenment and modernist understanding of time. The Enlightenment and modernist understandings of time are by and large, or essentially put, the understanding of time in terms of development, evolution and the linear. Okay. So, you see how the understanding of time and the understanding of development each informs the other. For instance, historians and critics like Ranajit Guha or Roberto Schwartz, for instance, okay, have pointed to this connection between colonialism and underdevelopment and the way these are theorized, right. So, Schwartz, for instance, holds that the entire framework, look at this slide, the framework of underdevelopment, okay, that is how you gauge, measure, declare a nation or part of the globe as underdeveloped, okay, is understood in terms of, this is beautifully put, cultural and social belatedness. Okay. Now, belated in terms of time, right, as if they, as I said a while ago, as if they are not keeping in time with the development and progress, culturally, socially, economically, okay, lagging behind in time as far or as in comparison with the nations that are declared to be developed. Therefore, it is a powerful fiction, as some critics say, okay, where different parts of the world exist in different times or phases of belatedness. Look at this phrase, different parts of the world exist in different, we almost say time zones, not in the way time we understand time zones, but in different economic time zones or different socio-cultural time zones, okay, in terms of development. Therefore, the present, for a developing country, the present is always elsewhere, right. They are forever lagging behind, they have to catch up. So, the present in which a developing country lives today is the past of a developed country. That is the framework, or that is the powerful motive within which we, at least a mainstream discourse of development, understand itself, understand other nations that are both developed and nations that are not developed. Okay. So, you see how time is such an important factor. As I said, belatedness is a very powerful trope or metaphor in the discourse of development. Now, let us look at what the World Commission on Culture and Development in 1992 has to declare. Okay. The World Commission on Culture and Development in 1992 declared that culture may be defined as ways of living together. Okay. Remember, we had defined culture, at least we had said that one of the ways of defining culture is that culture is a way of living. Now, if you look at this slide here, we had stopped at this. We had said that culture is ways of living, different cultures have different ways of living, right, for everyday life, the social, cultural, economic arrangements, the political arrangements, etc., right, with of course, more onus on cultural practices, everyday practices. Okay. But there is an important addition here, together. Okay. Culture is seen as ways of living together, and you will see how this living together in a pluralist, in a pluralist setup, in a globalized pluralist setup, is the onus of the reports, for instance, given by the World Commission on Culture and Development. So, culture is ways of living together according to this framework. Then the World Commission on Culture and Development focused or laid great emphasis on certain aspects. Okay. Now, let us look at this slide here. For instance, it lays most importance not on economics, okay, not on productivity, on consumption, okay, not even on all aspects of the cultural really. It laid a great emphasis on values, right, and brought in things, abstract things, non-tangible things like values onto the discourse of development, and insisted that looking at cultural values in all their pluralism or plurality, okay, should be at least brought center stage in any discussion or any discourse on development. So, values is something that was that was emphasized by the World Commission. Second, culture was not simply everyday practices, culture was not simply a way of living or even way of living together. Culture was called the catalyst for development. look at the difference here. Okay, we usually talk about, we think that there is something purely economic, purely infrastructural as far as development is concerned, but here culture, particularly as understood as values, when understood as values, is seen as a catalyst for development. It is seen as something that sets development on its or development going. Next, development is not seen as wealth. Remember, we had said that the mainstream discourse often looks at development in terms of economic well-being, in terms of the wealth of nations, if you will. Okay? But in this case, development is seen not as wealth, but something that enhances the freedom of people. Okay? So, look at words like values, words like freedom. These are what have been brought to the fore, or have been brought, these are what have been brought center stage by looking at the importance of culture in development, and that is the way in which we are going to look at a topic like development within cultural studies. And then this development, okay, is an ethic. This development is an ethic that is culturally sensitive, that is sensitive to different cultures, to different cultural practices, right. So, let us look at this again. What are the keywords here? The keywords in the World Commission report on culture and development are values, freedom, ethics, sensitivity. Okay. Usually things that are not center stage in a discourse of development. So, the scope again, as the Commission declares, the scope of studying development under the aegis or under the framework of cultural studies may include things like culture as a right, okay, the practices of all communities, okay, all groups as a fundamental human right. So, culture is a right, and as far as development is concerned, the issue of culture is something that has to be treated as a fundamental human right. Then cultural policy, okay, not just policies to do with social welfare or economic welfare, but also clear cultural policies would have to be devised if you have to have development in terms of culture. Economic and social practices, okay, and particularly the diversity and heterogeneity of economic and social practices are to be considered. Sustainable development of all communities, of all cultures are to be honed, are to be sustainable development policies are to be created, okay, keeping in mind the culture of the people or the ways of living of the people. And finally, culture is to be seen as the environment for well-being. Okay, so culture, so to speak, is not just a backdrop, okay, of development, but it is to be seen as an environment, okay, with which we interact, right, in almost a dialectic process, okay, for well-being. So, these are some of the ways in which the scope of studying culture within, development and culture together may be worked out. Then we also come to another aspect which is given to us by the practitioners of development within the cultural studies framework, and this is cultural practices as development. Look at this, cultural practices not on their own, but practices are to be considered as development processes. Okay? Therefore, culture is to be seen as a mechanism. So, culture, remember, is then not simply a backdrop, it is also not just an environment, but cultural practices are to be seen as mechanisms. Okay? And those cultural practices are to be tied to things like things that are to do with development, for instance, effective education, communication, empowerment and capacity building, right, all of the people. Okay, so, development that is people centric or people centered, right. So, this aspect of development, as the critics have argued, may be met with only by considering cultural practices as mechanisms for development, and when they are also people centric. Okay. Therefore, what are the resources of this way of looking at, what are resources towards development as given by culture? Okay, so we've by now we have accepted the fact that culture is a part of development, the way of living, and particularly heterogeneous ways of living, diversity, the practices singular to certain communities are things that we cannot neglect or avoid. So, what are the resources then in this case that culture can give us for development? The resources that culture can give us for development are these: heritage, values, myths, beliefs, and modes of expression. Now, if you look at this closely, right, every culture would have a heritage. Now, by heritage we do not mean simply things that have come down to us or to any culture from antiquity. Okay? These are not things that are to be museumized or things that are of value only to tourists. Okay? The heritage of a certain people lives on in their day to day practices, in the day to day activities, for instance. Okay? So, it is not removed from their present or their everyday lives. The same with values, right. Every culture, every community, every group, okay, has a certain set of values which have been entrenched, okay, in them, with which they live, and where particularly in this case there is usually no universality. There may be some universal values, very few universal values, for instance, but values are also culture specific, right. So, the next is myths. Again, myths are not to do only with some storytelling or some narratives about prince and princesses and gods and goddesses. They are everyday myths, everyday things that people live by, which again are very dear to them. Okay. Then same with beliefs, right. Same with beliefs regarding the universe, the same with beliefs regarding to life on earth, right, life as we live here, and different modes of expression. Modes of expression vary from one culture to another. So, instead of looking at these as liabilities, or instead of sort of brushing them, pushing them under the carpet and pretending that these things are not important, pretending that these things are to do with very superficial aspects of a culture, and that only the economic is the most economic activities are sort of the bedrock of culture, is to ignore a very important component of culture. So, studying or looking at development from a cultural studies perspective, particularly as given to us by say the World Commission on Culture and Development, or so many critics who have to offer alternative discourses to the mainstream economics based discourse of development. Okay, they insist that let us turn these so called peripheral things into, this is the word here, into resources of development. Okay. So, development policies should be should be created or established keeping in mind these so called or hitherto called peripheral areas of development. Therefore, this is very beautifully put by a critic, people matter. Okay. You see, all these things that we have been discussing so far are to do with people. For instance, what are the things that are to do with people? Okay, is living together, culture as a way of living together. Okay. Then resources, talking about different resources that people have as a collective, as a community. Then talking about effective communication, right, talking about capacity building. Okay, values, all these things are people centric, and the critics here claim, or the proponents of this school of thought claim, that bring people center stage. Okay. The whole discourse of development cannot do without putting people first, and hence it is not simply again that people matter, it is also that people come first. So, where would we then, if we had a if you did take up policies based on this sort of argumentation, okay, then where would these be applied? Now, some of the areas, a few areas in which this application can be done are, for instance, human rights, are issues of governance, of environment, of marginalized groups in conflict situations, and health. And again, if you look at this, all of these, right, what are these doing? All of these are only reiterating the fact that people matter or that people come first. It's obviously human rights, okay, where people matter, governance, environment, studying the environment, and applying theories of culture and development to the environment, to marginalized groups that are not considered the dominant groups, and hence sometimes are often ignored, okay. Marginalized groups, conflict situations, in situations of war, in situations of terrorism, in situations even of migration, of refugee situations, okay. These are if these are not brought center stage in the discourse of development, then a huge chunk of the population is left out, okay. Then the development is not meant for everyone. And finally, health for all, right. So, these are the areas in which, if you are arguing for development from a cultural studies perspective, okay, these are the areas which you would bring to the forefront in the discourse. Next, I had mentioned Vincent Tucker, and I had said that Tucker is one of the most well known or one of the better known scholars as far as the alternative discourses to development goes, and I will refer to his essay which I have talked about, the myth of development, and we will see how development is imagined, okay, according to Tucker, how development is imagined and how we have to counter, or we can counter, okay, and we should counter the dominant ways of imagining development. Tucker says here, development is not a natural process. I think an immensely important statement to make, okay. Development is not a natural process. Development is not a teleological process, okay. Development doesn't happen naturally. Development is something that is constructed, whose policies are decided by real human beings living in real time, okay. So, it is not something that is God given or even a process of physical process of nature, okay. So, it is very important for us to remember when we critique the dominant discourses of development from a cultural studies perspective, that development is not a natural process, it is man-made. Then the next point, he says that there is a mythology, there is a dominant mythology of Western beliefs. Now, by mythology here, we are on Western mythology, we are not referring to things like Greek mythology and Greek gods and goddesses, okay. We are referring to certain myths which are for instance, which may be the Enlightenment myth of development along a linear process, okay, along an uninterrupted process of a sort of a forward unfolding, okay, of development processes, right. This is tied to point number 1. Such a way of looking at development as something that would unfold by over time in a teleological manner is a natural, I'm making a fallacy here. It's a natural kind of naturalistic kind of mistake we are making here, okay. So, it is the myths of certain Western beliefs, for instance, again the unfolding of time in the traditionalist framework, if you remember, okay, through which makes the mistake, which is responsible for the mistake we make in believing development as something that is natural. Third, development is not a transcultural concept that can claim universal validity, that there is no universal validity. Okay, you have to accept the fact, you have to recognize the fact that development, the main discourse of development, okay, is one that is deeply infused or informed by Western beliefs, okay, about time, about progress, right, and it is not on it, and it cannot be a transcultural concept. That is, it cannot be a concept that can be applied to all cultures over time and space. Okay? It is not a transcendental concept that transcends all barriers of culture and time and space. Okay? So, this whole idea of development as is imagined in the Western framework, as Tucker says, is one that is that mistakenly holds that development as they understand it can be applied unproblematically across time and space, across different cultures, and that it has a universal validity. It does not. It is, let us read on, a specifically Western myth, and many languages have no equivalents. Very interesting. Okay? The development is a word, is a vocabulary in the English language. Okay? And Tucker points out that we think that development is a universal concept, but the fact is, the interesting fact is that there may be many languages in which the word development does not occur. There may be synonyms, but there is no word that can stand for the kind of development that the mainstream processes look at. Next, such myths or shared beliefs play an important role in mobilizing the energies, okay, for social reproduction and in legitimizing the actions of the believers. Look at this. These myths, now the better way to put it is, as he puts it here, is shared beliefs. Okay? Myths are shared beliefs. I said nothing to do with gods and goddesses of the past. These shared beliefs, Tucker says, these beliefs play an important role in mobilizing energies for social reproduction and in, this is important, legitimizing the actions of the believers. Those who follow the mainstream myth, okay, they feel right that their policies, okay, their ways of looking at so called developing or underdeveloped. Okay, now all these words are now to be put within single, within the inverted commas, because they are now problematized. The whole idea of developed, developing, underdeveloped countries is again perhaps a myth. Okay. So, but Tucker says that why do these people who make such policies based on these so called myths or Western shared beliefs, okay, how do they have the power to do so, right? The answer here is that because they are shared, they are shared so deeply, not only in, this is important, not only in the developed, so called developed world, but also many people belonging to the developed, so called developing and underdeveloped countries, okay, nations, they too share these collective myths about development being what? Development being a natural process, where every country has to unfold its so called development within the discourse or within a certain template that is given to us, given to the world by only a certain set of shared beliefs. Do you follow? Okay. And this is the kind of mainstream thinking that critics, arguing from a critical development theory perspectives or a cultural studies perspective, okay, would say would begin to kind of begin to critique very severely, and they would then say that they will also point to the fact, for instance, that there are even cultures, languages where the term development is not there in their vocabulary. Next, I am reading again from Tucker, and I shall explain it in a while. Tucker says in his essay, development as a practical and intellectual project has been steeped in optimism, okay, as both a practical and an intellectual project. Okay. Again, optimism is this kind of optimism, at least a kind of optimism that is is unproblematic, or is a kind of optimism that is a straightforward sort of optimism, okay, that all nations are going to develop in a certain way. Okay. So, he says that such optimism informs both the practical aspects, okay, and the intellectual, the thinking process that goes into development and understanding development and development policies. Then he says, yet after more than 3 decades of development, many areas, look at this, many areas of the world are worse off today. Okay. So, after more than 30 years of understanding development, of imagining development, okay, of devising development policies, more than 30 years have passed of this way of thinking, but there are today still many areas, as he says, of the world that are worse off today than they were 30 years ago, despite development programs and aid. You see, if you, there's, for instance, he gives an example here. He says millions of Africans suffer and die from starvation and malnutrition today, despite development programs and despite aid problems, programs. Okay. So, there is definitely something wrong and in this way of doing development. Okay. And Tucker and the rest would there point out that, which means that you have tried to develop countries, you have tried to develop areas of the world that are still starving today, and you have failed there. Why? Because you have imposed your shared beliefs without giving importance to what? And this is where culture comes in, without giving importance to the resources of the people. Remember, what were the resources of the people to be brought in a cultural studies understanding of development? These were values. Okay. These were their myths that are peculiar or singular to each and every culture. Okay. These are some of the ways in which you have to weave the process of development, okay, where development is not only economic development, development is more importantly cultural development, where people matter. Okay. So, in the face of such failure, deterioration and destruction, Tucker says, we cannot persist in talking about development as the harbinger of human emancipation. This is a very strong statement he is making here. He is saying that there is too much evidence, okay? There is too much evidence by those areas of the world which have not at all been helped by 30 years or more of development programs and practices and of giving aid to those nations. He says, in the face of such failures, and which he calls deterioration, in the face of such deterioration and destruction, as he puts it, we can no longer cling to the fact that, or he says, we can no longer persist in talking about this idea, this way of looking at development, this term development even, okay, as something that is going to bring in human freedom, human dignity and human liberation. There is something else. So, the call here is of course not to throw development, or that we do not want development, but to raise very important alternative questions, like what do you mean when you say the word development? Okay. You have to admit the fact that development can never be a transcultural concept, not simply because it is not available in the vocabulary of some languages, not simply at that level. Okay. It is at the level of how you understand intellectually, remember how intellectually you understand development, imagine development, and practically how you devise development policies. All these things need to be looked at, to be relooked with a very radical eye, with a very radical disposition, okay? Because of the fact, as Tucker says, that these development policies and programs have failed, as he says, miserably, okay, for some countries. Next, the other word, problematic word here is modernity, right? If teleology, enlightenment thinking, if reason, these are some of the important keywords in the dominant discourse of development, and equally if not more important keyword is modernity. Okay? Like we question the term development, right? we have also to question the term modern. What is modern? What is it to be modern? Okay. Is modern the same for all cultures, or that is, like some people have tried to make it as with development, is modern or can modern ever be a transcultural concept? Okay. So, let us look at this modernity and its discontents as given to us by the critics of the mainstream discourse. They say that there are various modernities and not a single modernity. We have to accept the fact that what is modern for the Western world need not be modern for world that are regions that are not Western. Okay. So, being modern has different contours, has different nuances, has different descriptions, excuse me, descriptions and definitions, okay, all over the world. So, one of the things to understand is, like development, modernity is not a homogeneous term. Next, the Enlightenment is itself the outcome, a historical configuration which owes much to the Islamic world of scholarship and science. Okay. Now, you have to again understand that this enlightenment that we have talked about, which is celebrated as a Western gift, so to speak, to entire mankind, is something to which the Islamic world has also contributed to its scholarship and science. Okay. So, segregating the Western world from the rest of the world again is problematic here. Okay. So, again point number 3, various components of modernity often diverge or form new configurations. This is again important. Okay. So, there are modernities then, okay, and different components of modernity, right, will come together, and in different times in different regions of the world will make or we will create new configurations. So, you cannot have a concept called modernity in the first place. Okay. You would have to replace it, okay, with modernities, not simply because modernity is different everywhere, also as the last point mentions it here, okay, the components of modernity will form different configurations also in the same region over time, so that modernity cannot be understood homogeneously also in a temporal way. Okay. So, modernity as part of development is also critiqued by these scholars. Therefore, now that we have understood, right, we have understood that all these words are problematic: development, enlightenment, modernity, reason, right, developing underdeveloped and developed nations. These are terms that belong to a discourse, but these are terms that need to be revised, as many critics here would agree, in quite a radical sort of a way. So, if we have to do this, then Tucker and others says, what are the strategies? How do we change ourselves? How do we change our looking into or considering these things? How do we reimagine, so to speak, development? If development has been imagined in a certain way, how do we reimagine this? So, these are some of the strategies being given here. For instance, there is a need to democratize, okay, in a very radical sort of a way, right. We all believe in democracy, but it should be a democracy where the resources, okay, where the resources of all cultures, of all communities are given importance in the process of development, right. Only then there would be a truly democratic process of development, okay. Not democratizing just a few sections of society, not democratizing only some classes, or even in say India some castes, right, not only including their resources, their cultural resources, okay. It would mean including the cultural resources of all classes, all castes, and all sections of society. Next important point or strategy is that there is a need to demythologize. Remember, we looked at the myth of development through Tucker, okay, and how is myth understood in this sense? Myth is understood as what? Myth is understood as shared beliefs, right. Remember, we talked about shared myth is not understood in the terms of stories of yore, of how, for instance, some god or goddess created the world, etc. Myth is understood as shared beliefs, even current, beliefs currently shared today as we sit here, shared by some of us, right. So, there is a need therefore to demythologize ideas of development, of progress, ideas of what it means to have a good life, for instance, ideas of what it means for a nation to be a healthy nation. Do we look at it only from the point of view of economic well-being? Also to demythologize what things like resources mean, okay. Is the wealth of a nation simply is it the resource that we are talking about, are our resources to do with values, with ideas of freedom, with ideas of equality, democracy, etc. So, concepts then need to be demythologized, in the sense that the word development has also developed a myth around it. Okay. So, we have to demythologize even the word development. Okay. Next, he says that there is a need to deconstruct. There is a need to deconstruct the dominant discourse. Okay. There is a need to dismantle the dominant discourse of development, right, and even in a textual sort of way, okay, even in a Derridian sort of way, to lay bare the way in which the whole discourse works with the use of words. Right. The discourse of development is a very powerful one. Words get thrown around everywhere, and people consume those words often uncritically. All this can be done finally only if what is called with what we have only when we have what is called the critical gaze. Here, gaze is a critical look. Not of course just a look, of course, the critical looking into issues of development. Okay. In fact, even a radical re-look at the issues of development. Okay. So, quickly just spending a minute with Bhikkhu Parekh, as I said, because he has this important document called A Commitment to Cultural Pluralism, and I will quickly read just a sentence or two from here. All societies today are culturally heterogeneous in different degrees, and thanks to such forces as industrialization, the easy mobility of goods and people, and the global reach of the multinational media, members of even the most traditional and isolated societies are daily exposed to new ways of life, right. And finally, a culturally homogeneous society whose members share and mechanically follow an identical body of beliefs and practices is today no more than an anthropological fiction. Okay. Says because of because of the media, because of the easy reach of people and the easy way to highlight their cultures, to study their cultures, and to know about other people, has today proven that it is impossible. Okay, rather it has never been the case, rather, okay, that there is a culturally homogeneous society. That he calls an anthropological fiction. And then he says that these are some of the ways how we go about it and how we look at development anew. They have to be these things: political and methodological commitment, okay, to development in a real sense. Multicultural education, there has to be multicultural national symbols. National symbols cannot belong to either one caste or a class. Then an understanding and appreciation of a truly multicultural society. Okay. And also multiple or double or even multiple descriptions of societies, of ideas of development, which may be mutually conflicting, and mutual criticism and mutual correction and openness to correction, and cultural and constitutional experiments. He said, and all these, if you realize that Parekh is offering us, is with an understanding, as I said, a commitment to pluralism, understanding that the world indeed is more plural than we can ever imagine or have ever imagined. So, if you get a question like how does the World Commission on Culture and Development view culture, then you would say that it is culture is viewed as ways of living together, not simply as ways of living as we have understood in the past, and values freedom, a development ethic, cultural sensitivity. Okay. These are to be given equal importance, if not prime importance, and culture is to be seen as a catalyst, okay, for the development process. Second, if you get a question like this, how is culture a resource for development, then you have to say that these resources are people's resources. Okay. It is a framework in which we say that people matter, and what we get from people, from a community, are these: their heritage, their values, their beliefs, their modes of expression, and their myths. These are things that have to be considered within the framework of development. If you have to have true development where people come first, then you cannot do away with cannot do away with the beliefs, the values that people have lived by or lived with for so many years. Just because they do not tally with the so called dominant, or some would say Western beliefs of what beliefs about the world, about development, about various concepts, etc. Okay. If you want to have true development, then that would have to go. What we need is culturally specific values, myths, and modes of expression, beliefs, etc. Finally, describe briefly, if you get a question like describe briefly Tucker's arguments on development, then you would say that Tucker's essay is important, his work is important, because he has shown us the way we have always subscribed to a certain imagination of way of imagining development, where development is based on Western concepts, on Western beliefs, where development is seen as a natural process, where also, as Guha and Schwartz have shown before, that development of the underdevelopments of some nations, the so called underdevelopment is a result of a certain economic and social belatedness, that the present is always elsewhere in the developed nations. We are always catching up with, or some countries are always catching up with the developed nations. This is a completely false way of looking at, a completely biased way of imagining what development is, and he says that once we imagine what development is, only then in the right way, only then can our policies change. Then there are a plurality of discourses. If you have to have development by rehabilitating the answer, the idea of culture, as also Bhikkhu Parekh has said, there has to be a plurality of discourses. There has to be an understanding of multiculturalism, of understanding that audiences are plural, they are never homogeneous, okay? And it should be anti-totalizing, and there has to be common grounds of assembly. As we saw again with Parekh, the multicultural society, multiple descriptions, right, mutual criticism, a commitment to pluralism, all these are important, right. So, as I said in the beginning, I would like to again end by saying that development is a very loaded term, right, and this the recent further loading of the term development has come about with the critique of the term development, okay, with the critical gaze that has been given to this term by so many culturally sensitive, so many critics who consider it a duty, an ethical act to criticize the dominant mode of development. Remember what was said a while ago, when millions of people are starving after decades, after 30-40 decades of development, definitely we need to look at development from another perspective, from a new perspective. And cultural studies looking at development gives you at least one of the new perspectives of looking at development, where you consider culture as a way of living together, particularly in today's world, living together with commitment and with appreciation of multiculturalism and plurality. Thank you for now.